The Enlightenment era from about 705 to 785 followed the century after the scientific revolution, which took place in the 17th century. The Enlightenment was the time of philosophical productivity where men were starting to ponder about their human rights, and it is where egalitarianism, the equal rights for all people, showed up. These Enlightenment philosophers such as Voltaire, Thomas Paine, and John Locke created kind of a social revolution where all people who read their ideas and their pamphlets wanted to have more freedoms over the powerful and oppressive governments. Which is why this era affected many countries, especially the country we currently know as the United States of America.
The Enlightenment era was a philosophical renaissance in which higher educated people started rejecting ideas such as monarchy and established governments. The idea of egalitarianism was the basis for starting new governments such as democratic republics. Most of the philosophers, such as Thomas Paine and Voltaire, were spiteful towards the church and monarchy system, and they argued these establishments were oppressive towards the common man. This is why they wrote pamphlets and newsletters to inform members of both lower and middle classes that they do not have proper human rights and they deserve more rights, such as the right to vote. This reflected into the new American nation because Great Britain, a monarch nation, were trying to suppress the colonists, but many enlightened thinkers such as Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Ben Franklin, and James Madison wanted independence from this tyrannical nation and wanted to push for more enlightened governments. So begins the Revolutionary War. It was a hard-fought war, but the colonists finally overcame the power of the British Empire and gained independence while becoming their own sovereign nation, where the government is a democratic republic, people get to vote, own their own private land, and unlike England, they have freedom of religion. At this time, freedom of religion was a very revolutionary idea, since most countries were ruled by a monarchy that was divinely ordained. Most philosophers that were successful in America came from Europe, and this was because the roots of the Enlightenment era started in France and diffused throughout the world slowly. And since America was a mostly British but some part French colony, the ideas from the Enlightenment naturally spread to America. One example of this phenomenon is philosopher and writer Thomas Paine. Benjamin Franklin paid for Thomas Paine's voyage to America because he heard about his successful books in France, such as The Age of Reason. Thomas Paine was a very respected philosopher in Europe. In fact, he was one of the main drivers of the Enlightenment era. Him coming to the new American nation affected it immensely with works such as Common Sense and Rights of Man. Thomas Paine really fueled the American people and strengthened their morale to rebel against Britain. His works inspired rules of the government, such as freedom of religion, speech, press, and also inspired writing of the Third and Fourth Amendment. Also, another leader in the Revolution was Thomas Jefferson. He was really influenced by John Locke and his ideas. These influential leaders reflected their ideas in many ways to better form and give shape to America.
The American thinkers who had the most influence by the Enlightenment were John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and James Madison and Thomas Paine. John Adams wrote a defense of the Constitution of the U.S. government, a dissertation on canon and federal law, and discourses on Davila, which all argued why America should stray away from Great Britain's grasp. He also many times defended and emphasized the idea of a balanced government, that there has to be a strong executive branch to protect the people against powerful, quote-unquote, aristocrats, and a strong legislative government to protect the people against the powerful dictator. For example, Britain would make the colonists only be able to buy British products, and if they tried to sell their own or buy anything else that's not British, that would be a federal crime and they would be prosecuted. Great Britain would also make it so they would have to export and import with British ships, so they couldn't have their own. So this is why Benjamin Franklin was really against Great Britain. Mainly, Benjamin Franklin endorsed American frugal capitalistic ideals that we see today. Thomas Jefferson is most known for drafting the Declaration of Independence other than being the third president. He believed strongly in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He was a scientist, a statesman, and very much an intelligent philosopher. Thomas Jefferson read a lot of books, especially ones written by European philosophers, in particular John Locke. Most of John Locke's ideals actually translated to the Declaration of Independence as well as the U.S. Constitution through Thomas Jefferson's writing. Another very influential U.S. thinker was U.S. fourth President James Madison. Other than being president, he was very well known for writing the U.S. Constitution. He was very influenced by European philosopher Baron de Montesquieu. James Madison believed very much in the fact that there needs to be a separation of church and state, and all people should have the right to freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Another United States enlightened thinker who was lesser known because he was never on any form of currency or never a U.S. president. Thomas Paine was one of the original philosophers in Europe who was already popular for his other works such as The Age of Reason. He came over from France to America because he was very supportive of what the colonists wanted out of breaking away from Britain, so Ben Franklin paid for his voyage over to America. Other Enlightenment philosophers who weren't from the U.S. were Voltaire, Baron Montesquieu, and John Locke. French philosopher Baron de Montesquieu was most influential for his Trias Politica, which stated there should be an executive branch, a judicial branch, and a legislative branch of the government. Sounds familiar? Yes. He was also responsible for taking a part in creating republicanism. John Locke was an English philosopher who advocated for freedom of individual rights for the quote-unquote common man. He stated people have the collective authority to overrule a corrupt government if they so please. He also had a part in creating republicanism. French philosopher Voltaire is arguably one of the most influential characters out of all the Enlightenment era. He had written over 2,000 books and 20,000 letters and pamphlets throughout the 18th century of Europe. He was most famous for advocating freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and separation of church and state.
Throughout the millennia, almost all countries have been theocracies. A theocracy is when a government is completely controlled by a religion. Ultimately, this was not a very ethical government, because people in theocracies didn't have freedom of speech. Many times people were unrightfully prosecuted and gruesomely killed from the ignorance of the faulty system's authorities. This is the flaw that many of the Enlightenment philosophers realized. This is why many were spiteful toward the established religion and pushed for a more modern system of government that gave freedom of speech and freedom of thought. The United States is very much an archetype of Enlightenment era in this way. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and George Washington all wanted the freedoms in the Constitution and government. This really showed in the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. It first accused the King of England for falsely imprisoning its citizens and violating their human rights. It is for this reason that he said he and the nation wanted to break away from England, implying it is not a nation fit for a prospering ethical system. Jefferson stated there should be these freedoms for people who live in any nation, and he stated it would be tyrannical to go about it any other way.